All right, so we got the Simple Numbers team here going through our video. Let me go back to make sure everybody's got the contact information. So what we're going to do is go through the planning template to help people kind of do it yourself. Even if you're going to reach out and get somebody to help you with this process, I really, really, really want to encourage you to attempt to do it yourself, because I think this is an important education process for you to understand the connection of profitability and cash flow. And I've made it as simple as possible, but this is not going to be easy. But it is a simplified version, though, of how to understand profit and cash flow. And I think if everybody puts some investment in it, you will find it extremely valuable. As I noted on the first video, every client that we've gone through this process with has changed what their decision was once they got to the end of it. And the key is quantification. You got to quantify, 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 quantify. And it's so easy to hear what somebody tells you that sounds good, but when I go to the data, I try to go to the data with no preconceived idea of what it's going to tell me. And so as I go through that process, then I can be much more effective in terms of letting the data talk to me and give me direction in terms of what to expect and what can I do to change the outcome. Some things I don't have control over, but there's a lot of things I do have control over. So that's what this process is really kind of built around. Joining us for this video, one of my partners, Brandon Gray, is the head of our consulting team. Brandon will kind of jump in. And throughout this process, I'll probably ask Brandon and Veronica, they've had a good many discussions directly. Certainly, we want to be mindful of our clients' confidentiality and those things, but certainly we can share anecdotal information without sharing the client's name and those kind of things of really just experiences and share those experiences for them to understand, kind of, what we're seeing, because I think the more that we look at what actually is happening, it'll help to avert a lot of people's fears in terms of, yes, there's going to be some challenges, but yes, there's a lot of good going on out there too. So as we go through the template, the first thing is we're going to go through, I'm going to go through a couple of these slides and kind of give you a precursor. So I'm not going to go deep into these because I want to get into a case study example, because I believe showing you a live example of kind of some adapted data that we've worked with, I think you'll get a much better sense. But essentially, step one is input the actuals from your P&L. Now, you're going to input them in our Simple Numbers condensed format. There's a couple of different ways you can kind of pick and choose. You can drop your data to an Excel file and kind of point the cells to it. Pick whatever way you want to do it, but I think most people can kind of work their way into it fairly easily. Secondly, once you input that data, then we're going to input the balance sheet. The balance sheet is where you're probably going to have the greatest challenge. I've created a traditional balance sheet template that will convert a traditional balance sheet into this input format. And so use that if you have a hard time picking and choosing and kind of where the balance sheet pieces go in that process. Once we do that, then we're going to go through the forecasting process. So we'll come back and forth and kind of do that one. And then we're going to do the operating expense piece of looking at that piece. Then we're going to, the next step is look at direct labor. And then the next step, we're going to look at then, some of the other key drivers of the balance sheet that affect cash flow and deal with a couple of those. And then we're going to look at, kind of our funding sources. Do we have to change an infrastructure? Can we go get some debt structure? What's our buffer capital requirements? And then we're going to finally come back and look at distributions, contributions, some of those available, to the business. And then you're going to stop and analyze, that process. So I think the easiest thing at this point is let me kind of walk you through an example of one of a data set that we've made up that is pretty indicative of what we see. And I chose a restaurant largely because there's a lot of discussion of restaurants. I mean, they're probably I think of all the media discussion, that we've heard, restaurants are closed in that process. So what we did is, this is the template that we created, and this is the monthly actual data. Now we've rounded it, and obviously, but you'll have actual to the dollar. You can put into the dollars or to the penny. That's up to you. But this business was doing, you can kind of see, on average across 12 months, or I mean across the last 12 months and the first 2 months of the year, they're kind of averaging $202,000 a month. But they've got some high months. They've got a 262, a 250, in that particular time of year, and some lower times of the year. You see fairly consistent gross margin number. So during normal operations, they have a pretty normal gross margin number from that. And their labor varies. They'll have some higher months and some lower months. They'll have some 3 payday months. So you got a couple of those that you sometimes have to take into account. And then their operating expenses. One of the ways that once you put this data in, we've also got a tab over here that once you fill in the P&L, we've got this rolling 12 P&L. So I can look at, here is the 12 months ended December of 19 for that business. So they did $2.4 million in revenue. They made a 10% profit. Great. Okay, here's January. The 12 months into January. So this is our signature rolling 12 way of seeing the business. And so in that case, that is February 1st of 2019 to January 31st of 20. And then March 1st of 19 through February of 20. And so you can see business is pretty stable. They actually were on a little bit of an uptick in terms of profitability. So they went from 10% up to 11%. I preloaded the forecast that we did with this example. And so you can see that rolling 12 losses, if you just did a P&L and looked at this and say, well, what's the deepest negative loss I'm going to incur? It's out here in October. The rolling 12 number would be $233,000 for the 12 months ended October. So November to October, $233,000, and then you can see they start to earn their way back. But these are all formulas, so there's no input on this sheet. This is just a way to see the data. When I go back over here to the monthly plan, also down here, this is the input of the balance sheet. So I've inputted, both their accounts receivable. They have very little accounts receivable, just some minor stuff here and there. Mostly inventory, a little bit of other current assets. They get terms from their vendors, and they have some deferred revenue. So this particular model, they do events. And so they have enough space that it's a blend of both restaurant and event, is this example, and then some other liabilities. And so you can see their fixed assets, net book value fixed assets, and then you see their cash, and this business had nothing drawn on a line of credit. So this business was running, you can see, their average cash balance was about $303,000 across the 14-month period. You can see they took various distributions throughout the year, usually around the end of the quarter. So pretty typical model of kind of how businesses that follow the simple numbers philosophy operate. They did have some loss months. So you can see the month of August was a loss because it was a low revenue month, but they didn't adjust labor. They kept people on. And so pretty typical example of some good months. They had a lost money in November, broke even roughly in December. So typical, seasonal example. So when we come over to the model, as we said, let's go back over to the first thing that we're going to do. So we input the actual numbers, and then we input the balance sheet. So now we're at this point. We're going to forecast revenues, especially be particularly careful of the next 90 days. What is the immediate impact? And then will it pop back? Will revenue be a slow build back? Any long-term effects and those types of things. And so as we look at this one, get it back around. So in this case, this business, we're showing them as if they work for like the first week or so of March, and then would be in, just expect them to be in one of the shelter-in-place cities where they're totally shut down. And so essentially showing them less revenue in March, totally shut in April, totally shut in May. Now in this case, because food is their cost of goods sold, they don't have any costs because they're not delivering, they're not doing, they're shut, they're done. And so in this case, I can drive their cost of goods sold with a percentage. If that's not the case, then I probably have to either fiddle with this percentage or just hard code, that gross margin number, if it's a number that isn't variable until it gets back to variability. We show them coming out in June with a little bit of income, ramping back up a little bit more in July, August, but not getting back to full average revenues until October, but then fall off again around holiday time. So one of the things that you have to look at when you're in a discretionary industry is, it's probably not going to be a real plentiful holiday season. Let's hope it is, but it's one of those that you kind of have to prepare for. So in their case, they got to prepare for a slightly less. So this revenue is 6% less than the previous year. This one's 5% less than the previous year. And then figure things really kind of get back going in the first of the next year. So, agree or disagree is really kind of irrelevant. This is just the exercise that you've got to go through in that process. And then we show them essentially cutting back their staff across these last 3 months of, as I said in the first video, picture George Bailey talking to the lady at the Bailey Building and Loan and saying, how much do you need? And she says, I want my $27. And he says, I didn't ask you how much you want. I said, how much do you need? And then she says, I need $2. And he kisses her on the forehead and thanks her. And this is really where you got to go to these examples and say, figure out what people need in that process. And some people are we've heard stories. I have to brag on our servicemen. One of our clients told me a story that he went to his employees and asked them what they need, and one of his employees was an ex-Marine, and he said, hey boss, I'm good. Go take care of somebody else. I can get by on what I have, and you need to help the next guy. And so that's the kind of stuff that you really love to hear, in that process. And there's, cases and cases of that over and over again, happening, and probably need a little more of that in the news than other things, and in my opinion, but I digress. So anyway, getting back to full labor force or full active labor force, probably back to full labor force here back when they're kind of at their busier times back during the summer. And then same thing in feathering back into management labor, taking a cut here, in the 3-month period, and then coming back. They got 2 months of rent deferral here, 3 months of rent deferral, and then that picks back up, after that. So essentially kicking that rent to the back end of the lease, in essence, in that process. So as you look at this, if you just take the P&L approach, you can look at this and just sum the losses, and you go, oh, okay, well, we lost $241,000, knowing that, well, I probably got another loss out here of a little bit, but I'm probably okay, after that, and that's fine. Now, what happens though on a cash flow basis? So when we come down here and start forecasting, in that process, their AR, we use days for AR forecasting, so you just use what they had been doing. Inventory, we want to forecast inventory on a dollars basis. So in this case, because their inventory has a large amount of consumables and things that will spoil with age, they really let inventory go to just the sustainable inventory during the shutdown period. But notice that they have to put inventory back to full level the month before they start back up. So not a huge number, but it is a number that you got to plan for in that concept. Other current assets, we just kept them at the same number. There's probably not going to be little to no movement in those numbers during this time. Same with other liabilities. Accounts payable and deferred revenue are going to act, differently, in a sense that they're going to be based on days. So we figure that in the short run, expect AP days to go up. Your vendors it will probably give you a little bit of credit, and then expect them to go down, and expect I get less support 2 to 3 months from now, and I probably have to expect that to last for a reasonable period of time, and then slowly get back to normal terms, because these things affect my cash flow. And then if you happen to have deferred revenue, what we did is we just used the same deferred revenue days because it's working off of what revenue you have at the current month. And so you can see these months we have 4 and 3 deferred revenue days, but there's no deferred revenue because there's no income. And then you can see deferred revenue building back up here across time. So that's a key component that's going to help cash flow. So as I said, let's go back up here. So once we predicted the balance sheet, I'm now out here and I'm showing, $241,000 of losses. Let's actually look over here. Veronica created this really good graph that I think is excellent in terms of showing an understanding of the distinction between the two. In this particular model, because they don't have much in the terms of trade capital variation, it's losses that you see here that they got to fund. And so there's a little bit of, there's this big hole that we got to quantify, come out, make it moderate. We make a little income, we lose a little, and then we're back to normal, in that next year. So one of the easiest ways that I've looked at to kind of what is this number is if you come over here to the graph data, what you're going to look at is in this line here, and actually let me set the titles. I forgot to do that before we publish this. All right, so if I take the losses that start here in March of cash, these are cash flow negatives, and go as far as those cash flow negatives go, my cash flow negatives in this case is actually pretty close to my losses because I don't have a lot of trade capital swings. So those two are pretty close, roughly 240 each. Now, what happens to cash though? This happens to be a business that when they came into the challenge period, they had $297,000 of cash. And so you can see that as I input this number in the forecast, this is a number that I'll go through this one live with you and show you. If I take out all of the borrowings on the line of credit, I'm just looking at where does my buffer capital go negative? Well, that means I got to go borrow money. So let's say, and I have to put it in as a negative number because it's debt. So I got to borrow $50,000 to get cash back to a positive number. Keep it at $50,000 the next month. Keep it at, say, $40,000 the next month. And then I can keep it at $40,000 the next month. And then keep it at $40,000 the next month. And then keep it at about $20,000 the next month. And then I'm good. And I'm back to positive. So the error that you can easily make in determining this is a situation, we'll see this on a couple of the other case studies, is my cash flow is a dramatically different number than my loss number in terms of the deepest negative hole that I dig. And in this case, the loss and the cash flow is roughly the same, but the worst off I probably get with borrowing is $50,000 in the hole. But still, if I'm going to, one, I'm hoping that these numbers work, and this is where it's going to be. If I'm going to the bank to ask for an SBA loan, I'm going to come over here to this graph data, and I'm going to look at that number, and I'm going to say, this is the best place to look for how much to borrow. And as the most of the webinars that we've seen on the SBA disaster loan process, you need to ask for as much as you can now, and you can always repay it. And the key is be careful and don't waste it. Repay it. But the thing is in this particular case, I'd be asking for a $250,000 SBA loan to cover the funding of these because I really need my buffer cash back. And I need a little bit of that time, to get back over that, in that process. And so to me, that would be in this particular model how I would go about it. Now, this is where an SBA disaster loan process is golden, because if you look at the balance sheet of this particular business, there's really, there's net book value of fixed assets of $238,000, but the bank doesn't want food as inventory as collateral. And oh, by the way, you got liabilities of deferred revenue to go perform events in the future that you've already collected the cash on. So with negative $67,000 of trade capital, I don't really have anything that the bank is looking at as collateral for a loan. And so it takes an SBA situation where they're willing to do it, without that. But as I said earlier, you've got to be careful to still use that money wisely and not create, a bigger burn, in that process. So that's a good first case study example of kind of how that process is. So let me let the team weigh in and see if they've got any other things to add for this.
I think one thing that's important to note is the balance sheet on the bottom. We are typically used to seeing in our simple numbers cash flow statement where negative is cash going out.
Mm-hmm.
And here this is truly a balance sheet, and so this is truly the end of month balance. And I think that's an important thing to just remember, because typically we don't see negative amounts on the balance sheet.
Yeah. Keep in mind, anything that's a blue field is an input field.
Yep.
Well, that's kind of the playground to make changes in. If you get outside of that, you may break some formulas.
Yeah. One of the things, and I'll show you this on the balance sheet, to your point, Veronica, is I've created a balance sheet template that you can input your balance sheet in a traditional format, and then it points it to our simple numbers working format. And so there's a blank sheet that you can put yours in, and then here's an example of one that you can see that this is the sales company example, I believe, that of how theirs, input. So this will give you a way. It's still a condensed version, but you can easily kind of find, the places to plug those in. So that'll make it a whole lot easier for you to kind of get it in a structure, to start making it work, in that environment. Okay. All right. So let's do another example. So let's go through the manufacturing example, the make example. So once again, this is a business that, let's look at the rolling 12s. They were doing about $4.6 million of revenue at about a really nice profit percentage, 20% to 18%. So hanging in there pretty good, in that process. And so you can see from the rolling 12, they get knocked back to, this is back to January of the next year is their low point of they drop back to a $2.4 million business instead of a $4.6 million business. So if you take simplistic math and say, oh, I'm going to drop from being a $4.6 million business to a $2.4 million business, you would think, my goodness, how do I fund $2 million? Well, it's not $2.2 million. And so once again, let's kind of go through the process. And so in their case, what we predicted was short month in March, closed in April and May, and then a slow ramp back to slightly less production, than they previously had, and then not getting back to same or better production until 2021, in that process. Now, here's my point about labor. We have spent the last 10 to 12 years carefully, begrudgingly grinding our way to build teams of people that make and do and serve the customers that we serve. This is where you really got to look hard at how long that you've got to keep this team together as long and as far as you can, because I think the winners in this process are the people that are able to keep their team together and able to keep things out there as long as possible. But my Gregism of the day is many times our heart is bigger than our checkbook. And so we've got to do the hard work of quantifying things and saying, how big is my checkbook and how far can I go with this? And if my checkbook runs out, can I use somebody else's checkbook? But just remember, if I use somebody else's checkbook, I got to pay it back. And you just don't want to, make that problem later when you really were better off to solve it now. But this example shows them pretty much keeping their labor pretty much as it is and going through that process. Once again, this is a business that had kind of followed, actually was a little ahead. They had cash. One of the things that you can see, I dropped in a number here. They were running, our normal target for businesses are 50% return on invested capital. This business was operating at a 44% return on invested capital at February before the crisis hit. And the only reason why they were at 44% is because they their 2 months core capital target was about 350 instead of 546. So they had idle cash in their business beyond what they needed. Kind of a good time to have idle cash, because here's what you see. Notice on their line of credit, we turned their business off and slowly ramped it up, and they don't get back to full production until January. They don't borrow money until January, and they borrow a little bit in February, and then they're back positive. So they're only, the worst, deepest hole they dig is $150,000 in that process.
Greg, real quick, you mentioned this just a few minutes ago when you were talking about, are you going to need to go into somebody else's checkbook, right? And you mentioned on our first video that when we're talking about catalytic spend and looking at a return on investment, we want a minimum of 50% in between 12 and 24 months.
Right.
If they need to go and take out a loan, whether it's SBA or from a regular lender, does that 50% within 24 months still apply, or should we try to make that shorter, or what's the advice there?
Well, I mean, so one, let me make a clarifying comment. I don't look at getting through disruptive negative cash flows like this. I don't look at that as a launch capital. That's just an extraordinary event. And so, that's one where I wouldn't look at that way, because I've got to stay in business to play another day. It's more so right here is when I'm coming out of it and there's work to be done. This is where you can say, well, I can just let the business come to me, and we're not going to be aggressive to go after it, but we're just going to do what we do, and I'm not going to try to throw accelerant on it. So launch capital is an accelerant. I'm going to hire a salesperson that I didn't have before. That's an accelerant. I'm going to spend money on a new social media campaign, or I'm going to rebrand, or I'm going to go to trade shows and all of those things, and that you've never done before. Those are accelerants. Those would be things that I absolutely would want. Now the thing is in terms of, you have to look at it and say, if I'm spending that money here when I'm close to break even, it's probably going to be a pretty good return on investment, because I don't have to improve much to improve profitability. But the thing is I have to see positive results of profitability improvement because I spent the money. Otherwise, I'm only making a bad situation worse. So I've got to sharpen my betting capacity in terms of making these choices. And, I don't want people to so be afraid to not do anything, but you have to make an extra, dark night of the soul, view of, is this going to work, or have I looked at all alternatives? Because I mean, you guys have seen this, with your consulting client calls, is people want to do the thing that sounds convenient and easy. And listen, money chases easy. Entrepreneurs overcome hard, and so. We don't have a lot of money. Now we have access to money, but it's got a string attached to it that requires it to be repaid. It's not our capital, and that's what this business is well capitalized. So it's risking its own capital to get back to here, and hopefully even do better than this forecast. And that would be kind of, in this example, that was roughly based on, I would think, that's an example of something where it likely can outperform this, but we've got to project this to know how much to ask for, in that process. So there again, I think going forward, you just have to be really careful in your discretionary choice spends. This is a case where let's get the have-tos back first, and then we got to have a prioritization process to go through the launch capitals. Yep.
And kind of on that, Greg, as you mentioned, launch capital and the planning, the folks who have capital now are going ahead, planning it through this, and then they're earmarking some dollars that they know that there's going to be opportunity in the marketplace. They got their ear to the ground. And so as Jack Welch said, look for the train wreck. Well, the train wreck's here. And so they're just kind of lying in wait to know when the time is right and I see the need in the marketplace, I've got the capital already allocated and what my plan's going to look like. And those are the folks who come out of it ahead.
Yeah. So let's look. This is an interesting example because, as we said, if I go back to their monthly plan and I look at, well, let's just sum the loss months, and so the loss months are 478,000. So we say, oh, well, let's go ask for 478,000. Well, not so fast. If we look at the losses, the cash flow losses, actually, I missed a month there. The negative cash flow from May through January of next year is 801,000. Check that, big guy. So, if I'm this business, I'm going to look at that and go, I mean, if I have the ability to repay it sooner and I don't need it, I'm going to ask for 800,000. Because here's why I would ask for 800,000. Because if I go back and look at their historical capacity, this business produces in normal times $813,000 a year in profit when things are working normally. Well, if I'm only going to pay less than 4% interest on an $800,000 request to get through that cash flow hit, I feel pretty good about coming back and repaying that loan. I can't repay it in 1 year, although I probably can repay it in 1 year, because here's what happens. It'll take a little longer because I'm going to lose. If you look at rolling 12 losses, I'm going to project a tax loss of 454,000. So as I take a loss, the first 454,000 that I make coming back out has no tax burden on it. And so I get back to almost over half of that number repaid as I shoot back through. And so probably you figure 1.5 years, I'd have that money back and repaid. And so once again, to your point, Brandon, that's somebody, if I can go get funding and I can buy a competitor who didn't plan so well, and I can buy a new piece of equipment that have my eye on, hey, that's where the opportunity is in that process. So super. All right, any other thoughts on this guy? All right, so let's look at the sales example next. So this is based on looking at a $15 million run rate of a business. So they were making about 13% profit. And so looking at their monthly plan, one of the things in this industry, so a reasonable amount of cash, carrying about $1 million in cash, in that process. One of the things I'll show you in this business, and this happens to a lot of businesses that are in the hard asset sales business, we have quite a few clients that live in this quarterly sales mindset goal. Look at what happened. Look at this wave pattern of you have profit at the end of the quarter, and then you have negative cash flow, and then it takes you the next quarter to get your cash flow back, and then you have negative cash flow, and then you have go up, go down, go up, go down. I mean, it is this classic wave pattern of cash flow. And so in times like these, you can see this one, we really created some crazy swing patterns here going forward, and this one in its forecast. So essentially here, it is still funding this negative, but I've got to be mindful of some of these dips out here as well, in that process. And so I've kind of got to see, where I get to in that. And so in this one, you can see that we didn't go dark, but here's a case where if I've got mostly sales commission only salespeople, they got to eat. And I would have liked to have thought that they would have followed Dave Ramsey and had 12 months of living expenses in a cash account or in a mason jar underneath their bed, but probably they didn't. And so therefore, if I want to keep these highly effective people that I've worked really hard to get, I better be paying them something of a stipend to get them through this period in that process. And so this one, we didn't show much of an expense ramp down. So you can see from an expense standpoint, they're going to go through a situation of about $1 million net operating income loss but notice on their debt structure, they never really get cash wise are kind of out here. This one actually they never get to negative. And so the question here becomes, if I can forecast my losses, I'm probably going to still ask for 750 to a million to cover these losses up here, because I'm making a really big bet that things are going to come back online out here. And the nice thing is I can go borrow it, have it, and it's a low cost of money, and I can send it back if I don't think I'm going to make it. I don't want that hanging over me. I'm not really sure. I haven't looked at what kind of, if there's probably going to be personal guarantee requirements, I think, on SBA. And so you certainly don't think you're going to get the money and walk away with it and close your business up. That's not going to happen. But there again, if I can project these losses, I'm probably going to put together, a request that's probably going to be in the 700,000 or so range, because once again, to your point, Brandon, just because I don't go below zero in cash doesn't mean that I need some funding to get through this, because I don't want to, we've had clients in similar industries to this that when their cash got down to here and you hit another aftershock bump in the market, you go zero in a hurry, and all of a sudden you can't deliver goods, your customers lose faith in you, and then you're dead. And that's what puts you out in that process.
That's a great point. As we're talking with people, one of the most common things I hear is everybody can put together the plan for getting skinny. Mm-hmm. You're looking through discretionary expenses. You're trying to get as much off of your books as you possibly can. But what I'm not hearing enough of, and what we're trying to help people think about, is how am I going to ramp this thing back up?
Right.
And if you don't get enough capital now while the getting's good, as Greg mentioned, and things are slower to ramp back up, or I can't go and market like I normally would, or those types of things, then that's going to be a pretty tough situation to overcome. So think aggressively right now while you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add, Veronica?
No, I'm good.
All right. So let's look at the services template. So services is really where you could easily have. So we've got quite a few people in the marketing, and I apologize to my marketing friends that I've said you need to turn off your marketing spend, but I will follow that up with, you need to turn it back on as fast as you can. But in a survival mode, it really is one of those things that you are talking about a pause of 30, 60 days, but here's the thing. You're going to spend in the next 12 months or next 10 months what you would have spent in 12 months. So just expect that that's going to happen, and you got to fund it, on the other side. But unfortunately, our clients in the travel industry that we're doing a lot of SEO spend. Now, I hope Google's not listening to this, but hey, turn off your Google ad spend, because nobody's looking for you at the moment. If you're trying to rent a villa or, or some type of travel, event that you're going to. And so that's a quick and easy thing, to turn off. But at the end of the day, and all of my marketing friends know that I am a big advocate of good marketing. But you're going to have to do hand-to-hand combat to go find your customer coming back out of it, because a lot of other people will be trying to find those people too, in that process. But just be ready to market back up. But so I kind of base this off of kind of a blended version of marketing, service firm. And so if you are kind of in this, $3 million range, of run rate, well, the first thing you got to look at is how deep do you go? Now, some of these businesses work off of retainers, but as we've seen, hey, people cancel retainers. So you just never know. So in this case, we showed a fairly rapid decline, almost going dark in May, and then a slow ramp back up. And so you can see how much percentage they're off of the previous year's income there. But then pretty much keeping their staff, kind of as is, and then management labor, kind of trying to keep everything stable for the business. Now, the one advantage, most all the marketing clients that we work with, believe it or not, have bought into our core capital target concept. So this example, we're coming into it with $400,000 of cash, in that process. And so you can see that even with that, they don't start hitting the line of credit till out here into August and September, and they get the problem in this services model is the latency of how long the decline lasts. And so this is one where you got to go back to it and say, go back to your rolling 12 picture and say, we were at 3.3 million. And so here in December, we're at 2.4. And then, we're not getting back to 3 million until the end of 21. And so once again, you've got to look at it and say, how much of my team can I protect, and how deep in a hole am I willing to go? Because you can see their worst case rolling 12 losses gets up to 568. That's a lot. That's a lot for a service business. You're digging a loss hole that is almost double of what your annual net income is. So it would take you, with after taxes, as much as, probably 4 or 5 years of all of your after-tax profits going to repay that loan if you borrow the sum of those losses. And so here, this is one where you probably have to take some hard looks at saying, well, is my heart bigger than my real checkbook? Because I don't know how much my business will come back, during that time frame. And do I need to come up here and say, is there $10,000 or $20,000 of this labor number that is somebody that I just can't afford to keep on? And once again, you got to look at it and say, if those people are earning their keep, I'd keep them on. If somebody's a marginal performer, I'm not as much committed, to keep paying that person. I might pay them for a couple of months, but probably out here, this is a business that is probably going to have a 180-day relook, or maybe even a 90-day relook, and say, I'm going to do a 90-day plan, and then at the end of 90 days, I'm going to do another 90-day plan and see how long of a recovery. Now, as we've monitored our 50 company simple numbers model that have looked at what we believe the economy, so, to give people some hope. So because our clients are all over, we monitor the U.S. economy. And so we have 50 clients that we keep a statistical model. We go back to 2013. And so what it's told us since that time is in 2014, there was 20% growth of that. It was a little over 300 million of revenue in that 50 clients, and all ranges of sizes in different industries, in different geographies, because we're not centric to where we are. And so 20% growth in 14, 15% growth in 15 and 16, about a little over 20% growth in 17, about 12 to 13% growth in 18. And that was the year that there was demand, but there wasn't capacity. We had this labor constriction in 2018 across our client base. And really, if we look back at that year, it was the construction sector that stalled in growth. And they were profitable, they just couldn't grow because they couldn't get people. And then it's kind of like the 3-lane highway that gets cut down to 2 lanes. Things started moving again in 19. And so we're seeing, I think the 2019, if I remember correctly, was somewhere around 13%, growth. And so, these are businesses that they're going to grow back really, really fast, I think, in terms of, as long as we just don't get hit with some other conflicts of things that keep them from doing it. And then it's just a question of, as I said, you want to go to the mat to protect your really key team members as long as you can. And then every man's got to make a choice in terms of the others that you're willing to help, but you may not, even in a long-term basis, if you're not going to keep that person long-term, I'm going to ask you, why are you keep paying them? And because I need to preserve capital as long as I can. But that's the one this one really strikes me is very interesting in a sense that it shows the greatest amount of potential latency, but actually I personally believe this one would recover much faster. I think we've taken more of a pessimistic view of the recovery in that process, but I still don't believe that in the example that we've given. I would probably push harder on probably trimming, some of the direct labor, back a little bit and build some more runway in that process.
So
Greg, one thing I would like to note is down here on the AR days,
Mm-hmm.
It's important that when we're predicting or, forecasting out, that we know that during this crisis, a lot of our customers are going to take a little bit longer to pay. So in this example, traditionally, I think there were about 35 days.
And I bumped it up to 60 all the way out through 2020, and then gradually brought it back to 50, but I kept it at 50, and so you got to be, you're right, it's a point well taken that you don't expect to get back to, we were enjoying very, very friendly terms. Now, here's when I stand on my soapbox. So one of the nice things that I get to do is I get to give this talk all over the world. And so I gave this talk in East Africa and the Middle East in the last 6 months. And in economies that are highly, highly focused on improving entrepreneurial activity. And every time I'd go in, so I spoke in Mauritius, I spoke in Kenya, I spoke in Tanzania, I spoke in Bahrain, twice in Saudi, and in Jordan. And so every place I went, I asked the question, how's your economy? Well, it's a little depressed. Really? Now, this is when the U.S. economy is just going crazy. And I said, well, why is that? I said, well, the multinational spending is down a bit, and the government spending's down. Really? Okay. Well, I said, now, I get that, and those are big things that affect the economy. But as an outsider who just showed up and just looking around out there, there's a lot of stuff going on, especially Kenya and Tanzania. I mean, man, there are people going everywhere. It's a buzz. And I said, listen, I get it that everybody in the entrepreneurial world wants to hit the home run. But I start the next book with this idea of figure out what the market needs, find a way to do it profitably, and then make sure that the profit equals 50% or better return on invested capital. And that's the 3 simple rules of business success. And I said, listen, you've got to look at other things because you're trusting things that get turned on and turned off on a whim. And I really think the U.S. in the last 10 years has become far more a private company dominated economy, and we're going to see this thing turn on a dime if we don't go through a prolonged shelter in place mode here. And if we come back out of that, I think you're going to see this economy heal a lot faster. You're going to see profits return and businesses getting back to being in business. And that's so much more flexible and more nimble than big, large corporate structures of the industrial age that lumbered their way through economic activity. Now, granted, we need the big companies. They do things that are important. But if you really pay attention to the big companies' P&Ls, we are a lot of their cost structure. We are the things that actually create the economic engine, and they're just the final mile, either in the raw product or ultimate end customer. And so I think you're going to see a fairly flexible economy out of this. Now, I'm just a chicken farmer from Alabama, so what do I know? But hey, I actually get to see a lot of data, and I will tell you that the biggest thing that I learned from those speaking events overseas is if you want to become a first world economy, it is about getting cash to move faster from the point of vendor to the ultimate customer, shortening that chain of time and then shrinking the margin to an acceptable win-win scenario for everybody involved. Because the biggest impediment to all of those areas was the fact of slow payment. It took way too much trade capital for people to launch a business in those economies, and so only the rich could play the game. You know who the biggest offender was in every one of those countries in terms of slow payment? The government. And it's like, okay, get this. I mean, the government is wanting to encourage entrepreneurism, but yet they're the ones that are delaying payments 60 to 90 to 120 days with tons of red tape. Listen, you got the money, you're going to eventually pay it. Just pay it faster. That is the easiest way to create economic activity. And so as long as we all understand this, so this is my challenge to everybody who's going to listen to this video. If you have resources, treat your vendors and customers as fairly as you can, because it will circle around and help us all. It is all about speed of margin as it moves through the economy. And it's not about one person applying extreme leverage just because they can. You are actually hurting yourself as much as everybody else in the long run. And if we can all take this attitude and this mindset, we are going to turn this thing around and stomp the ever-living life out of the coronavirus and stomp it all the way back to wherever it came from. Who knows where it came from? But at the end of the day, this is what the power of entrepreneurism is. And we can make an enormous difference if we all grasp this concept. So much from a high horse. All right, any more comments before we look at the input sheets?
The only thing I would add is in the service businesses, I've had a lot of conversations in the last few days, and it's a little bit of a different spot for many of them versus if you're in the travel industry or if you're you know, in the restaurant industry or some of the others, that it's been a very quick hit all of a sudden.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing some folks say is, well, you know, I've got a few little changes, maybe a couple cancellations, but for the most part, I'm okay.
Yeah.
And that said, we're, you know, to some degree, we're early into this.
Yeah.
So it's all about tracking your leading indicators. So go ahead now and have your plan of worst case scenario, what I have to do, and then what are the most leading indicators I can track on a daily basis to know when I need to start putting a plan into action. Because it's going to take a little while before it may show up in revenue. So it might be a leading source well before revenue either goes away or comes in. So watch those and track those, and that becomes your cue. Because it's, like I said, there's some folks impacted really substantially very quickly. Other folks, I've had several calls in the last couple of days where it's been much more gradual.
Yeah, and that, you know, and as we've talked about, we have we keep a list of clients in crisis on the wall over there, and out of about 300 business clients, we've only got 10 names on the wall. You know, and there'll be a few more added to it. You know, it'll probably grow to about 20. But I truly believe that the vast majority of the rest of them will actually be fine. Now, there will be a disruption. There will be some economic impact, but their very existence, it will be fine. And they will, in many cases. So one of the things I learned, I mean, I've got these gray hairs for a reason. I've been around for a while. I've lived through a bunch of recessions. And I paid particularly good attention in 2008 because I'd already been talking about the core capital target concept of the 2 months of core capital. And I kept listening to the news and listening to the economic activity. I'm going, gee, you know, this sounds pretty bad, but, you know, my phone's not ringing. And finally the phone rang, talked to the client, says, yeah, you know, I see all this crazy stuff. How do I protect my cash? And it was really then that, I mean, even though, I mean, we didn't have our aggregate study there at that time of when we were looking at that, we kept up on a real-time basis. But that was really kind of the first indication that I had that my clients have been listening to me about the 2 month thing, because I didn't get any calls about somebody having their line of credit pulled. I got calls about how do they protect their cash. And then as we saw coming out of it in 2009, 2010, 2011 were 3 of the most profitable years our clients have ever had. They didn't grow a ton, except a few actually did, but the vast majority of them were pretty stable, but they really got profitable because they were the only game in town. And so those are just time-honored principles that really are incredible when followed in that process. So, all right. Any other comments before we jump in to do a quick run through of the blank template? All right. So quite simply, the highlighted areas where you input, so pretty simple. So just go back and input your revenue, your cost of goods sold, this gross margin will calculate. These are formulas. Direct labor, input direct labor. If you don't have management labor and direct labor broken out, put all labor in direct labor and leave it there, and that'll be the easiest way. And then fill in facilities, marketing. Once you kind of fill in everything, just use other OpEx as kind of your plug number to balance to net income. That's kind of an easy way of doing it, once you pull all those things out. And then a few of these other items. Remember this other income expense section of positive numbers income and negative numbers expense in that process. Then on the balance sheet side, here's your input area. If you struggle with putting this input in the historical piece, remember we've got the traditional balance sheet template of here's the example, here's the blank template. Go put your balance sheet in this highlighted area, and it'll populate this for you to transfer it over, to the P&L. Guys, it's only 14 months of data. There's there's 12 lines of input per month in the P&L. There's probably about 12 lines of input in the balance sheet for every month. I think you can handle it. I want you to do this yourself. If you need help, Michael will work with you to try to find a way to help you in that process. We've got some processes to do it, very, very economically to get somebody over the hump. If you just can't do it, but please try on your own. And and that's really kind of what this is designed for, or get your bookkeeper or your accountant or somebody to kind of help you through that process. But that's really it, guys. I mean, that's what it takes. And then once you input it, then you're going to come over here to the I'm sorry, on the balance sheet. And once you input once you input the historical, then you're going to come over here and start working notice you can see up here, you're going to work your revenue forecast first, and then you're going to tweak the percentages to make sure understand that does cost of goods sold stay variable, or does it, you may have to tweak this number in these blank months to cover some costs that aren't there. Put in your direct labor, put in your other items. Payroll taxes, you can see, are grayed out because you're going to control payroll taxes by a percentage. It should be no less than 10%, but somewhere between 10 and 15% is kind of an average number of payroll taxes and benefits that we see. And then other OpEx, other income, other expense. And then once you're there, once you get the P&L forecast in, then you're going to tweak your AR days. You're going to plug in inventory as a dollar amount and let the days calculate. The AP days, you're going to control that by AP days. Now this is, for those of you that just want to get geeky, the way I'm calculating days is I'm taking, if it's accounts receivable in deferred revenue, it's based on the current month divided by 30 is the day amount of revenue that's being used in the calculation. And you can just follow the formulas and kind of see how I did it. But your days will vary because your volume is going through crazy fluctuations. And so that's why you may have some crazy day numbers in some of these transitional months. But once you get back to normal activity, it's going to be more like what you've seen. And that's why it's invaluable to put your historical data in here. Is you need to be able to see this historical data because it'll give you a calculation based on those. And actually I'll just see that one. We'll fix that template before we upload it. That one was actually hard coded. So I'll fix that calculation before we post the spreadsheet in the template. So anyway, but that's really kind of all you do. And once you input and tweak the balance sheet numbers, the last piece is if you see buffer capital go negative, I've got to input a line of credit number to get it back positive, and that line of credit number has to be input as a negative. And then if you are, one thing we didn't discuss much, if you still require distributions, you got to input your distributions down here, because right now my assumption is all profits stay in the business at this point. But if you have to force distributions out, this is where you key them in on a monthly basis, and it'll balance out to the equity piece. So hopefully that will help everybody go through the process, and hopefully this will help everybody. So any final comments from the team?
Like I was saying earlier, have your plan. Go through this, determine how much you need, reach out to the resources with SBA and other places to help with that. Have the plan, watch leading indicators, and then work the plan. And I think Greg made a very valid point. I was on a phone call earlier today, and the number one fear that entrepreneur had wasn't can they get through the storm? It was what's going to happen to my receivables. And so I think we can all, kind of work with each other instead of holding everybody hostage in terms of pay what we can pay. Let's keep the economy rolling in that regard, because it will come back around and benefit us all.
Yeah, absolutely. Veronica?
I have nothing.
All right. Mr. Mike?
To go.
All right. Well, the best way to reach out, the template, just email myself, greg.crabtree@cricpa.com, and so I can reach us there. The other one is simplenumbers.me, is our consulting website that obviously these things were posted on, so there's a contact page there that will reach us as well. And so if you need help, but as I said earlier, really want everybody to do their homework. This is one of those times that this is like, it's probably more than the midterm. This is probably the final exam. So we got to pass this class, and let's do it and make an A in it at the process. So appreciate everybody taking the time, and hope this really helps, and reach out if we can be of assistance. So thanks.